studio at the Boston Public Library in Copley Square. I'm Joe Matthew with Lunch Hour Live. With an authority on a story that's getting a lot of attention around here, we have a great opportunity to speak with someone who's done a great deal of research on a story that's getting a lot of play in Massachusetts, and that is how to best manage legal marijuana. Dr. Kevin Hill is director of the Division of Addiction Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He also works with Beth Israel Deaconess and is author of the book Marijuana, The Unbiased Truth About the World's Most Popular Weed. I've learned more about this topic from Dr. Hill than anyone, and thank you for coming in to see us, Doctor. It's great to have you today.
Thanks for having me back, Joe.
At the library. We have a lot of questions, which is typically how I start a conversation with you here. Recreational marijuana is now our reality in Massachusetts, and driving while high is a big concern. I'm going to start here because it's been in the news this week. Regulators, law enforcement, the governor himself are calling for a new law essentially on this. You've done a lot of research on it, Doctor. Can you describe, just to start off with, what effect marijuana has on us while we're driving?
Sure. No, it's a great question. I think people often try to compare the effects of cannabis on driving and the effects of alcohol on driving. I think simply put, both affect our ability to drive, but in different ways. It's also dependent upon how experienced the user is. But when you boil it down, essentially cannabis makes you overcorrect. It makes you do more to try to be cautious than you would if you were using alcohol, for example. And so you might be very cautious and drive 35 into 55, which can be dangerous. Mm-hmm. Alcohol is a little bit different. So alcohol, you won't do the things that you're supposed to do. So you may lay on the gas, you may not check your mirrors. And so, one of the typical sayings when we talk about the difference is that when you're drunk, you run red lights. When you're stoned, you stop at green lights.
That's not the first time I've heard that from people who say, hey, I'm actually safer when I drive high because what you're saying, I'm more cautious that way. That's not the way law enforcement sees it.
It's not at all. And again, I do want to point out that the experience of the user does play a role in this. But at the end of the day, I think what the governor is pushing for is trying to be able to hold people accountable for the decisions that they make.
Mm-hmm. And that needs to obviously happen if we're talking about social consumption. That's the next level here, is that we'll have marijuana cafes, we'll have maybe it's yoga studios or movie theaters or whatever. But the fact is, outside of the home, and you have to get in a car to leave there. We've had specially trained police officers who are doing field sobriety tests in the meantime because, as you've pointed out, Doctor, there's no equivalent to a breathalyzer.
Yeah, so where this is going to go and where the governor wants it to go now is to be able to do a couple of things, to do biochemical verification, so to be able to draw blood in the field, which is what they're already doing in Colorado, and to couple that with field sobriety testing. And as you mentioned, the law enforcement will have special officers who've been trained drug recognition experts, and those will be folks who will be able to testify in court.
And they're already in the field doing this, right?
They're already in the field doing it, and so I think that the push is to try to institute this in a larger way, to have more of those law enforcement officials to be trained to do this. And I think that's a good idea. It's kind of doing the best that you can with the available technology, as they're doing in Colorado. But my concern is that we're really not looking at the larger issue. And you had mentioned the breathalyzer piece. At the end of the day, we really don't have the technology to be able to test for cannabis impairment in the way that we can for alcohol. And I think that we should put more resources towards doing that. In other words, we have a problem, but it's kind of like we're putting a knee brace on when we need surgery, right? And I think that we've got a lot of smart people in this Commonwealth, and we really need to put more resources toward that. And I think the governor could allocate, could make a step towards allocating some of the tax revenues that we're gaining from the sale of cannabis, or we could mandate that some of these companies that are frankly printing money selling cannabis every day, one of which is a mile away from my hospital, we can mandate that they put a portion of their profits towards advancing that science. And it's mind-boggling, frankly, to sit here year after year and to really be spending time talking about a half step here. This is a suboptimal solution to the problem, and I don't think we should be making suboptimal solutions to problems when lives are on the line.
Well, no, certainly not when you're a scientist who does this for a living. You and I have been talking about this since the legalization debate began. Is it safe to say that there's really no additional scientific information now than there was then?
It's not a lot. I mean, people are working on it. For example, a colleague of mine in Colorado has received a grant from the state of Colorado to study this. I think the grant's probably not as large as we would like it to be, but nothing along those lines is going on in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And as you know, there are plenty of smart people in Massachusetts, right? We've got some pretty good institutions, MIT, Northeastern, Harvard, et cetera.
Yeah.
So if those folks were turned loose on this problem, I think we'd be able to find a solution, right? But that hasn't happened. And this is not the only area where that's true. I think when it comes to cannabis, talking about medicinal cannabis, and also the impact of legalization, really the rate and the scale of the research has not kept pace with public interest.
We're talking with Dr. Kevin Hill on Lunch Hour Live here, live from the Boston Public Library on WGBH News. If you're watching us on Facebook, please feel free to leave a comment, ask a question, and share it if this is important to you. One of the other big stories that's been impacting is the vaping story. There's a vaping ban now, essentially on all products. Of course, there's a marijuana component to this. Some people vape nicotine, but vaping THC oil has become a very popular alternative to actually smoking combustible marijuana. People are now without that. Has this been a massive regulatory failure from your perspective?
It's a rash move, certainly, I think, to take that step. When you look at the data, and again, I think all these decisions should be driven by the data. When you look at the data, the large majority of the problems, of the deaths, of other medical consequences that we've had relative to vaping have been with THC vape products obtained illicitly, so from the black market.
So this is a black market story.
Largely,
Yeah.
not entirely, but largely. And so again, when I think about vaping, I think there really needs to be a divide driven between people who are older, let's say 25 and above, and those 25 and below. And so for the people who are 25 and below, vaping is a serious issue, right? It's what they do instead of smoking cigarettes today. Any patient that I may see that's 25 and below for an opioid problem or an alcohol problem or a cannabis-related issue is also vaping either THC and or nicotine. So that's entirely bad. However, I think when you talk about the ban, this 4-month ban of all vaping devices, I think you're really losing sight of the fact that there are adults above 25 generally who have smoked cigarettes for years and years and years. And it does appear that vaping nicotine for those folks is a safer alternative, right? We'd wish they wouldn't do any of these things.
But they're inhaling smoke otherwise.
Yes, exactly. So I think for that group to perhaps drive them to New Hampshire or Rhode Island or whatever to try to obtain their vapes, perhaps that wasn't necessary.
In terms of what preceded this, though, was that a regulatory failure to not prevent some of this stuff from seeping into what is a regulated market? Granted, as you said, most of it is under the table. It's the black market.
Yeah, I don't see that as a regulatory problem. I mean, it's similar to what you and I have talked about for years about cannabis. I think one of the things that the pro-cannabis folks have always said is that legalizing cannabis is going to eliminate the black market, and I would always fire back in those debates that you're never going to eliminate the black market. And that's true with vape products. Someone's always going to have something that's a little different or cheaper or more accessible. So you're never going to eliminate that. And again, when you think about the fact that the majority of these deaths have been related to illicit THC vapes, I don't think you could have totally eliminated that.
Yeah. Dr. Hill is also, you should know, an addiction psychologist. He's a specialist in addiction, whether it's marijuana or any other substance. You should know that he supported the legalization of marijuana. But you also point out, if you want to correct me on that,
yeah,
by the
I mean,
way,
I think that the concept, right? I think the concept of legalization that adults should be able to do what they want to do as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else, which is germane to our conversation about driving.
Yes.
If that's legalization, then technically I support that. However, when I talk about cannabis to various groups and teach on the topic and things of that sort, we always talk about the difference between ideas and implementation.
That's right.
So the idea of legalization, I like.
You supported a framework. You may not be a fan of the current laws. That's safe
that
to
is
say?
accurate. That
Okay,
is accurate.
fine. With that said, though, you were pretty open-minded about it, is the point. Yet, you're an addiction specialist, and you've made the point that marijuana, while not alcohol, is addictive.
It is. And I think that when you talk about me being open-minded, I think you have to understand where I'm coming at this a bit different than many other people.
Yes.
I actually treat patients, right? So a lot of
Understood.
people who talk about this, they don't know what it's like to have a patient come to them and either say, hey, doc, look, I'm looking at cannabis as a possible solution to my chronic pain. I've tried 10 medicines, I've had 3 injections, and can this help me? Or they also don't see the other side of it, where a patient may come in, pushed in by their parents, let's say, and they're smoking cannabis 5 times a day, and they've been doing that for 2 years, and they're about to get kicked out of high school, right? So they don't see those ends of the spectrum. And I think that if you deal with patients, then you have to be open-minded, right? Cannabis is not entirely good. It's not entirely bad. Some people use it in potentially helpful ways. You know, that's what we've shown, that there are medicinal purposes. The fact of the matter is the majority of people who are using it medicinally aren't using it for things for which there's data.
Yes.
And similarly, for a subset of folks, about 9% of adults, about 16% of kids, it can be problematic. They can develop an addiction that affects other key areas of their lives, work, school, and relationships.
Is that a physical addiction as we kind of come to know it, or how would you describe it?
It is. So I like a simple definition: repeated use despite harm. But if you're going to break it down, there is a physical addiction to it. People who are using cannabis on a daily basis, multiple times a day, more often than not, will have what we call a cannabis withdrawal syndrome, marked by anxiety, irritability, difficulty sleeping. And that type of syndrome is exactly what gets people to continue to use, right? They may say, I had a patient come in yesterday, say, look, I don't think I can continue to smoke cannabis like I'm doing it and develop my business like I want to do it. I need to be able to try to stop. And people often have tried to do that on their own before, but when they do it, you know, they may say, I'm going to do it this Friday. And they don't smoke first thing in the morning. They drive to work. They go through the day. They have a tough time. By the end of the day, they may say, look, I just felt so out of sorts. By the end of the day, the only way I'd be able to get to sleep is if I were to smoke. So those withdrawal symptoms are critical. Not everyone describes them to the same degree, but it definitely...
But it indicates a dependency.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That said, you mentioned opioids. Is it a real alternative? We're in the middle of an opioid crisis, and few people know more about that than you.
So when we're talking about an opioid crisis, and it's very real, we treat these patients every day, they die. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's so important in teaching, you know, I'll be teaching in the next hour on opioids to a different group. And the fact of the matter is there's no safety net with these people. And so when you think about patients who are suffering from opioid addiction, I believe that you need to look at all possible solutions. And so when we've seen paper after paper, and again, it's not universal, but there seems to be a relationship between cannabinoids and opioids, whereby the use of cannabinoids in patients who are prescribed opioids for chronic pain, that can lessen their need for those opioids. I think you really need to look at that. And so one of the things that we've pushed for in various states that have medical cannabis policies is the erectment of an infrastructure so that you can study, you know, registry, so that you can study the impact of cannabis upon opioids. It does appear to me, for that group who has chronic pain, that if you can use cannabinoids, you're going to use fewer opioids, which I think is a good thing. However, I do also want to point out that for the group of folks who are using illicit opioids or using fentanyl, gram a day IV, I'm not saying put that person on cannabis. We have medications that work for those folks, so there's a difference.
Sure. It's not the only alternative.
It's not.
Then, obviously. Doctor, I'm going to ask you about CBD in a moment, because you can't walk out the door without hearing about it.
You
can't
probably
turn on
buy
the TV.
it right out there.
Yes, you really can.
At 7-Eleven down the street.
Before we do that, Emily on Twitter is asking if you could talk about what ailments are, in fact, effectively treated by cannabis, because people are buying medical marijuana for all kinds of things.
Sure. So again, you have cannabinoids right now. You have 3 FDA-approved cannabinoids, and they're approved for really 3 things: nausea and vomiting associated with chemotherapy, appetite stimulation in certain conditions like HIV, and then cannabidiol, CBD, has been approved for 2 pediatric epilepsy conditions. Beyond that, myself and a few other organizations have felt that the best data is for chronic pain, neuropathic pain, which is a different type of chronic pain, burning sensation that people get in their nerves, and then spasticity, muscle spasticity associated with multiple sclerosis. And so for those conditions, the data is not overwhelming, but it's enough so that if you are actually treating the patients who have these problems and they've tried first and second line treatments, you might want to consider cannabis or cannabinoids for those conditions.
Now, you can walk into CVS, Walgreens, 7-Eleven, you name it. You can get something called CBD. Do we know that that's what it really is? And are people using it for the right reasons?
No, great question. So we don't. So there's actually a paper published by a colleague of mine, Marcel Bond-Miller, who's in Pennsylvania now, and he published a paper in JAMA in 2017 that showed that the CBD preparations that we can buy out here on Boylston, only 30% of those commercially available products were accurately labeled. So there's either too much CBD, too little CBD, there's no CBD.
Or none at all.
Another follow-up paper showed that there are other substances sometimes in these commercially available products. And so that is why if you're an individual who may be drug tested as a part of your employment, you have to be very careful about what you put in your body. And we recommend generally if you're going to be drug tested, you avoid CBD products because you may test positive for THC, unfortunately. Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, the main active ingredient in marijuana.
Right. Which most people assume is not present in these products.
It should not, but unfortunately it is sometimes. And again, we've had many people who have not intended to use THC,
and
test
they find
positive.
themselves intoxicated or they test positive.
Yeah, so for those people, we just say, look, you're responsible for what you put in your body, and if you use CBD products and you test positive,
that's on you.
That's right.
Rob Gronkowski is even hawking CBD, the New England Patriot. This has become mainstream. It's the type of thing your grandparents are asking you about now because you can't not hear of it. I mention that because you work with a lot of organizations, including the NFL, as essentially a consultant, as an advisor when it comes to these issues. Everyone wants information on this right now. Yeah,
I'm bullish on CBD. I think it has a tremendous potential as a medication. Again, it has an FDA approval. However, 99% of the CBD that people are using is not the FDA-approved variety, which gets to the labeling issues that we've talked about. I think we also need to focus on really where the research is on CBD. Beyond the two pediatric epilepsy conditions that I mentioned, there isn't a ton of research, unfortunately. Where is there some research? Well, it appears that for some types of pain, it can be helpful. It appears to have some anti-anxiety properties, although, again, we would like to have more research there. It appears to have some antipsychotic properties. However, beyond those things, there really is very, very little evidence. There's a lot of animal work that suggests a lot of possibilities for CBD, but there's a right way and a wrong way. So we always worry about situations where millions of people are using something. They have very high hopes for using a medication to treat a medical condition, and there really isn't much evidence, particularly when there are other treatments that have evidence. That's where a relatively safe compound like CBD, I think on the whole it's a relatively safe compound, but if you're using it in lieu of medications that have been shown to have evidence, it can be dangerous, right? If you have really severe depression, and I've had this happen, I've had patients come in, they've had multiple medications, they've had shock therapy, they say, hey, look, doc, I'm done with all this. I want to use something that's, this CBD I keep hearing about that I see on TV. I want to use that. That's when a relatively safer medication can be dangerous.
Isn't that something? We have a lot to learn still, clearly, as we talk with Dr. Kevin Hill, who I often refer to as the Mythbuster, because that is what you have turned into in a lot of cases. This is a world full of myths, as you well know. We've got a couple of questions, one of them from the audience, on that train of thought. Is there any connection between cannabis use and the onset of dementia?
There is not a connection that has been shown. It is worth pointing out that there are studies ongoing. There are some local sites, in fact, where they're looking at dronabinol, which is essentially the pharmaceutically available THC, as a medication to treat some of the symptoms of dementia. But there's no evidence showing that using cannabis is going to make it more likely that you're going to develop dementia or other forms of cognitive impairment.
We talked about your research on addiction. How about the line that most of us have heard at one time or another? It's impossible to overdose on marijuana, that no one has ever died from a marijuana overdose.
That is true. So you're not going to have a fatal overdose. However, one of the things that we're always talking about, particularly relative to edibles, right? This is one of the scourges for people like me, this idea that we continue to have people overdosing on edibles. And that just illustrates poor education to me. I think that we've done a terrible job of educating people about edibles, for example, a typical serving size, right? Typical brownie has 100 milligrams of THC in it. The serving size is 10 milligrams, so you're asking somebody to eat 1/10 of a brownie. I don't know about you, Joe, but for me, when I have a brownie, I mean
kind of want the whole thing.
I mean the whole thing,
Yeah.
right? So there's not only that, but also the onset of action. So a patient will take a bite, nothing happens, take another bite, nothing happens.
Right.
If you're eating THC, it's not going to hit you for about 30 minutes. And so that's how people end up getting 4 or 5 times the dose. If you do that, especially if you're a naive user, you'll end up really feeling terrible. And that's how people end up in the ED, the emergency department. Those folks won't die, but it's entirely avoidable.
But they've overdosed
They have
in
overdosed.
the technical sense.
Yes.
You hear stories of psychotic episodes tied to edibles that people don't know where they are, that they're screaming. That is that urban legend, or is that happening?
No, definitely. So, anybody who has used cannabis or knows people who have used cannabis have known people who've had bad experiences, right? Everybody runs the risk. You may have a family history of psychosis. Some people, get paranoid when they use it. There are different degrees of that. But absolutely, on one side, I think most people would say the plus side for THC is it can make you high. You can have that euphoria. But on the flip side, for some folks, it can make you psychotic. Not for most, but it definitely can occur. And so that's why we always want to make sure that people are aware of what they're doing. And that gets back to the driving piece and educating people and just really making people aware. If you're an adult and you're making a decision to use, you need to know the risks and benefits.
Do you think of it as safer than alcohol?
So depends how you're looking at it. I technically do. Generally, when we talk about that safe conversation, we're talking about deaths, right? Mortality. So if you think about cannabis, alcohol, opioids, right? To me, that's a continuum. Cannabis, if we think death is the ultimate problem, cannabis is safer than alcohol, which in turn is safer than opioids. However, I do want to point this out. Although cannabis may be safer than these other two substances, doesn't mean that it's not potentially dangerous, right? You can take a safer substance and use it in a dangerous way, right? You can, eat that whole brownie and hop in your car and get out here and drive, and that could, on Storo Drive, and that could be a potentially major problem. So, on the whole, though, I would say that it is cannabis is safer than fentanyl for sure.
Yeah, it's tough to compare them, though, to your point.
A lot of people don't want to do that, though, Joe, and I think that's a mistake, right? When we talk about educating the public, we talk about educating young people.
Don't want to compare them?
They don't want to do that.
Yeah.
They feel that if you say that cannabis is safer than fentanyl,
then you're giving permission.
You're giving everybody the green light. I don't think that's true. I think that everyone, particularly young people who we must educate, I think they're capable of more. I give them more credit. I think they're able to process a more nuanced argument. But I differ from some folks on that.
That's because you actually work with them directly. I'll ask you lastly, and we can take a couple of minutes on this because I think it's important to a lot of people who are watching and listening right now. We live in a state where this is now legal. This is part of our reality. You can go to the store and buy it. You can bring it to your home and consume it. How do we deal with our kids on this? Because it's still taboo in most households. They might open a bottle of wine on the table, but then go somewhere else to consume marijuana or never talk about it at all with their kids. How do we address that?
Well, you have to build it before you need it. You have to be willing to address these issues, to talk about it so that people know that it's important, right? And so the example that I often use, I have 2 daughters, right? I'm asking them every day, what'd you do today? What'd you do in math? Tell me more. And they don't want to answer my questions on my schedule.
So this is not just me, okay.
However, if you do that, you're establishing that this topic's important. Similarly, when young people have questions about cannabis, you got to talk to them. You got to be honest whether or not you've used, et cetera. What could the potential benefits be? What are the detriments, particularly for young people? If you're willing to have those open and honest conversations, and they know how you live, and you're a role model, like it or not. They know, hey, this is not something that they do. I haven't seen them, that sort of thing. They may have done it in the past, that sort of thing. I think it sets an example so that on a Friday night, when they have that decision to make, they're less likely to make a choice to use. Doesn't mean that they might not at some point, but I think that you have to do that. If you don't do that, and I always think back to one of the patients that I've had years ago who said, look, my dad talks to me about 2 things, the Red Sox and the weather. That's not going to get it done, right? You have to talk about these important topics or else you have no chance when bad things are going down or when people are thinking about using.
Should then we be using it? Should people use it in front of their kids much like they would pour a glass of wine, or is there a second-hand issue there and other things that Should your kids know what you're doing?
I wouldn't recommend that.
I ask you that, by the way. Sorry for interrupting, because you work with so many kids. You hear their stories.
Yeah, so, I have to say, unfortunately, for a fair percentage, larger percentage than you would think, kids are aware of their parents' cannabis use,
Right.
and it becomes an issue, right? And so
In what way?
it's a part of, well, I had a patient who, the patient took some of the, their cannabis and their stuff, to use. So I think you have to be careful about that.
Sure.
I think that certainly open use of any substance, is a fine line to walk. I think another issue that people often don't talk about is that the use of alcohol. There's a number of drinks that you can have where you're not impaired.
Yes, right.
It's harder to do that with cannabis, right? For most of us,
You're there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's a challenge too. Like, my parents are going to get high tonight. I mean, I don't think that's a message that you want to send. And so I think that there needs to be clear messages, particularly for young people. And there's a wide divergence about how best to do that. I think you should be open and honest, have conversations, but I wouldn't advocate for using in front of kids.
And I guess the other way to get to that is when you speak with young people who have a problem and you're dealing with an addiction or you're dealing with interference in their lives, is there a trend in the way their parents communicated with them? Did they never talk about it? Did they start too late? Or is every case different?
I think every case is different. I think it's a very difficult thing to do. It's very hard to know how to approach it. It's very hard to detect use among kids. It's different than if they were using painkillers and things of that sort. And to help people stop using cannabis is an extreme challenge, particularly because it's hard to detect. By the time they get to me, they've often been using a lot. And again, that gets to the potency. They've been using a lot over a long period of time, and it's hard to kind of reverse that to try to solve that problem. So it's an extremely difficult challenge to try to help these folks. But ultimately, you have to try to figure out what is going to motivate them. Are they afraid of losing out on, getting into the school of their choice, or they want to be eligible to play in the sectionals in 2 weeks, or do they just want to continue to drive the family car? You got to figure out what motivates them in order to have a chance, right? Their one reason for changing is better than 10 that I can give them.
Thank you for the work you're doing. Dr. Kevin Hill has been at this for a lot of years, and his work becomes more important the more time goes on as laws like ours are passed, and so little is known about what you refer to as the world's most popular weed. Find his book on Amazon or wherever you buy books. It's called Marijuana, The Unbiased Truth About the World's Most Popular Weed. Dr. Kevin Hill is director of the Division of Addiction Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and also working at Beth Israel Deaconess. Thanks for all of your time, your insights this morning. Doctor, if this is important to you, like I said, share it and make sure someone else sees it. Thanks for being with us here on WGBH's Lunch Hour Live.
Always fun to talk with you, Joe.
Thank you, Doctor.
Appreciate it.
Have a great day, and we'll see you next time on the radio.